Hey everybody, this is Professor Steve from Grand Canyon University, and I wanted to bring a video for you today about Active Directory users and computers. This is probably the most widely used application that I use in my day-to-day operations managing Active Directory. So it's very, very important to understand what it is and all the features that are included with that and how to manage it. So to get there, you can go to Tools, and then you can go to Active Directory Users and Computers. So this is what it looks like. So basically, you have what you're currently using here. You could also change domain if you were trying to manage multiple domains in your environment. You could do that from the same console, assuming you have permissions to do so. Change domain controller if you had like 5 domain controllers in your environment. One, at a remote site you were trying to update really quickly because you didn't want to wait for replication to happen, replication timeout to happen. You could also change the domain controller to be that particular domain controller. Usually I find that helpful when I'm changing user permissions or let's see, any kind of account lockout passwords, that type of thing that I don't want to take 90 minutes or 180 minutes or whatnot for it to fully get down there. So this is the domain we're on, and these are the objects. So before I get into this, there's two types of folders, as it were, in Active Directory users and computers. The one like here for built-in, it looks like just a manila envelope. That is called a container, and you can see over here underneath, computers on the right here, it says container. And then there's also the folder that has a little icon on top of the manila folder, such as this one here. That is called an organizational unit, or OU for short. There's one very, very important thing to note about the difference between containers and organizational units. If you're looking to assign group policy settings to a computer or a user or both, you cannot apply group policy to a container. So anything that's in like the computer's container or the user's container, you cannot apply group policy to those. They can only be applied to organizational units, such as the domain controller's OU. Okay, so like in here now, I've got one object, instructor SRV, that's this server that I'm currently on. I can apply group policy to objects under that OU, no problem. But computers, this instructor workstation type of thing, that cannot have group policy assigned to it. So I can't stress that enough. Do not use computers and users to store the objects that are in your domain. Make sure that you set up organizational units to do that. One thing that I usually do as a best practice is to organize your organizational units in a manner that is consistent with your organization. There's like an organizations here going on. So what do I mean by that? So what we, I work for a bank. We have 15 locations right now, and we have an organizational unit for every branch of our each branch that we have. So I could have a branch in Chicago. I could have a branch in St. Louis. Those would actually be lined out right here. So if I were to do new organizational unit, call it Chicago, and then click OK, I would add that one. And then underneath Chicago, from an organization standpoint, I would create a new an organizational unit called computers, and then another organizational unit called users. I say users, it can hold groups as well, but just to say the two objects, computers and users and groups. Okay, so and then if I want to create a user, I'll create it underneath this user's OU and a computer's OU, and those would specifically be for Chicago. Then I would make another one. Say, for example, here we'll make another organization unit for, let's just call it Memphis. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll do a new organizational unit for computers. And another one for users. Okay, so now that I've got two of those set up, and I can put the Memphis user computers in that one, put the Chicago users computers in the other one. So, so that's pretty much it for that. So just to note, you can have two different kinds of things in here, as relates to containers and organizational units. So just make sure you use organizational units is the way you want to go. So what's underneath each of these? Let's minimize those. Underneath the built-in, these are the security groups that Active Directory creates by default whenever you create your domain. Okay, so things like account operators, let's see, server operators, users group, desktop users group. So these are some of the basic ones that are made and are used on a pretty regular basis. This is like the administrators group for your domain, and then, but this is not to be misconstrued with domain admins group. That is a different thing. So if I go underneath the users container, see, I also have domain admins here, and this is a difference of a global group in this type here, a global group, versus a domain local group. Okay, so there's different kind of security groups here. Oops, not logged in here, so give me a second. So you have domain local groups, global groups, and universal groups. Okay, so the important difference to note is that for a domain local group, the members of this group can be from any domain in the forest. So if you had multiple domains underneath the same forest, you can have users from different domains in that forest. This is used to for access to resources in one domain. So, for example, this allowed RODC, or read-only domain controller password replication group. If I put a user from another domain in here, then that other user could access, things based on this group. However, it doesn't go the other direction. If on that other domain, I would have to put a user from my domain into that group's domain local account to grant access to resources over there. So the difference on that. A global group, such as domain admins, for example, members can only be from this domain. So I cannot have a user from another domain in this group. Okay. However, the global groups can be used to access resources in any domain in the forest. Okay. So you could, in another domain, grant permission from this domain's domain admins group to that other domain. A resource in that domain based on that group. So that's what that one is. And then the universal group. This can have members from any domain in the forest, similar to the domain local groups, and can be used to access, or it can be used for access to resources in any domain in the forest, which is true because, for example, enterprise admins, enterprise read-only domain controllers, and schema admins are really forest level accounts. Okay, enterprise admin basically can control anything it wants to in a forest. The schema can change any schema things it wants in the forest. So things like that. So that's the differences between those three groups. Whereas if you built in, see, they're all domain local groups because they can only access resources in this one domain. So, okay. So let's create a user and a group, or a user and a group, because that'll be in one of your assignments for creating several users and groups. So find which organizational unit you want to go in. You can either right-click on the OU over here, or you can right-click in the white space to the left of it. So I say new, and we'll say user. And there's several parts of here that you need to do. So first name, we'll call it John, last name Doe, and you notice how it fills out this information here, but it does not do the username. The user login name can be anything you really need it to have right this second. You could either first initial, last name, first initial, middle initial, last name, first name, last name. It doesn't really matter. As long as you're consistent across the domain. I can't stress that enough, that if what you're going to do as far as a naming convention for your users and computers, or users and groups really, and computers, make sure it's consistent across the domain. Okay, so here I'll just do first initial last name, so J Doe. Make sure it has it populated in both fields. If you type it into one, it should type it into the other. And make sure that the domain is selected here. It should, but just make sure. And you can see it says it's creating it in the domain Memphis users organizational unit. So you can always tell where it's going to then. So next, give it a password. Type it in again. So you have some options here. User must change password next logon. It's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, if I were setting up a new user, I would say, hey, your username is JDoe, and your password is such and such password or whatever. Whenever they log in for the first time with that username and password, it will prompt them, the system will prompt them to change their password. So they'll have to do that the first time. You can uncheck that if you want to. Also, user cannot change password. If I select that, you'll notice that it's going to give me an error, so I can't have both done. So I have to uncheck and then do this one, because it won't. If your user can't change the password, there's no sense in having them be able to must change the password next logon. Okay, and password never expires. Basically, if you don't want them, or if you don't want your user to ever have a password that's never expires, then you would check that. I would only do that for a service account. So if you have a particular, say if you're running Microsoft SQL and you need SQL to be able to run as a service, you would specify a domain account with a password that never expires, so you don't want to have to worry about that password changing. So a user should have a password that expires, and they have to change it every, I would say 45, 90 days. Or 45, yeah, somewhere between 45 and 90 days. Count as disabled can also be done as well if you're really staging a user for, somebody that's coming in, in a month, but you don't want anybody else to log in with that account before then. You can certainly do that. So just by checking the box. So here we'll just do next, and finish, and then you notice that I have an account there. So when you go through that process, it's very, very basic. But what you can do is you can double click in here, and now you have a whole slew of different options to configure, where you can give them description, an office, email, telephone number, address if you're trying to get really granular with where they're located at, account information. If their account is ever locked out of a domain, then you can certainly uncheck this box. It'll actually say locked out. Would you like this account's locked out of the domain? You just check the box and hit OK, and that unlocks them from the domain. So profile, path directories, we're really getting to kind of the weeds here on the deep dive of creating a user account. So probably just do another video on creating or assigning different property values for users, types of thing. But you still have a ton of things you can do in here. So that's all the time we have for this video, and we'll see you next time.